There is a way to keep a lonely person in a state of constant waiting without ever giving them a single shred of commitment. Not by force, not by control, but by something far more subtle, far more dangerous. Hope. Because hope, when carefully rationed, becomes a leash. And breadcrumbing is the art of holding that leash without ever letting the other person realize they're being led. It doesn't start as manipulation. That's what makes it so effective. It starts as attention, a message at the right time, a compliment when it's least expected, a sudden reappearance after silence, just enough to spark something, but never enough to build something. And for someone who feels alone, not just physically but psychologically alone, this is intoxicating. Because loneliness doesn't just crave connection, it lowers the threshold for what counts as connection. A person who feels emotionally full will question inconsistency, but a person who feels empty, they will interpret inconsistency as mystery, as depth, as something worth chasing. This is where the shift happens. The breadcrumber doesn't need to give much. They just need to give less than what's needed, but more than nothing. A delayed reply that still comes. A canceled plan followed by, "We should do this soon." A vague promise that never fully materializes. And the brain fills in the gaps, because the human mind hates uncertainty more than it hates pain. So it creates stories. They're just busy. They're going through something. They'll come around. But beneath those rationalizations, something deeper is happening. Intermittent reinforcement, the same psychological mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You don't win every time. You win just enough to keep playing. And in breadcrumbing, the win isn't love. It's attention, unpredictable, irregular, emotionally charged, which makes it far more powerful than consistency. Because consistency can be understood, but unpredictability, it hooks the mind. Now the person isn't just waiting. They're anticipating, checking their phone, replaying past conversations, analyzing every word, every delay, every shift in tone. Not because they're irrational, but because their brain has been trained to search for patterns where none truly exist. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The breadcrumber often doesn't even need to lie. They don't promise forever. They don't explicitly commit. They just imply enough. And implication is more dangerous than a lie, because it lets the other person become the co-author of their own illusion. They imagine the future. They assign meaning. They invest emotionally in something that was never fully offered. And the more they invest, the harder it becomes to walk away. Because walking away would mean admitting something painful. That all those moments, all those signals, all that waiting might have meant nothing at all. So instead, they stay. Not because they're weak, but because they're caught inside a loop designed to feel like progress, when it's actually stagnation. And the breadcrumber, they hold all the power, because they control the one thing the other person has become dependent on. Access. Access to attention, access to possibility, access to what could be. But here's where it gets darker, because the longer this continues, the less it becomes about the breadcrumber, and the more it becomes about something happening inside the person being led, something that changes how they see themselves, how they value connection, how they tolerate emotional starvation. And once that shift happens, even if the breadcrumber disappears completely, the damage doesn't, because the mind has already learned a new rule, that love is something you wait for, suffer for, and never quite receive. And that's the moment where breadcrumbing stops being a behavior and starts becoming a psychological trap. One that most people don't even realize they're in until it's already too late. By the time they realize it, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like gravity, something pulling them back, again and again, to the same person, the same pattern, the same quiet disappointment disguised as almost. Because breadcrumbing doesn't just keep you waiting, it rewires what waiting feels like. At first, the silence hurts. Then, it becomes familiar. Then, strangely, it becomes expected. And expectation is where the trap tightens. Because now, the person isn't reacting to what is happening. They're reacting to what might happen next. A message could come at any moment, a sudden shift, a breakthrough, a moment where everything finally makes sense. And that possibility becomes addictive. More addictive than certainty ever could be. This is why people don't leave. Not because they don't see the red flags, but because they've been conditioned to believe that endurance will eventually be rewarded. That if they just stay a little longer, understand a little more, give a little more of themselves, they'll finally reach the version of the connection they've been imagining all along. But here's the truth most people avoid. Breadcrumbing doesn't collapse because of time. It collapses because of awareness. The moment you stop asking, "What do they mean by this?" and start asking, "What am I consistently receiving?" everything changes. Because patterns don't lie. Intentions can be faked. Words can be crafted. But patterns reveal structure, and the structure of breadcrumbing is brutally simple. Minimal effort, maximum emotional return. The breadcrumber gives just enough to keep the door open, while the other person does all the emotional labor of keeping the relationship alive. But here's where it becomes even more uncomfortable. Because breaking free isn't just about walking away from them. It's about confronting something inside yourself. The part that accepted less than it needed and called it hope. The part that confused attention with care. The part that kept justifying inconsistency because consistency never came. And that confrontation, it's painful. Because it forces a realization most people spend years avoiding, that the connection wasn't real in the way they believed, but the attachment, that was real, and letting go of something emotionally real, even if it was built on illusion, feels like loss. This is why people relapse, they go back, not because the situation improved, but because the absence feels worse than the illusion. Silence feels heavier than false hope. Clarity feels colder than confusion. So they return to the breadcrumbing, knowing exactly what it is, and still hoping somehow it will become something else. But it never does, because breadcrumbing survives on one condition: that you keep interpreting fragments as promises. The moment you stop doing that, the entire structure collapses. No drama, no closure, no final explanation. Just silence that finally makes sense. And in that silence, something unfamiliar begins to emerge. Not excitement, not obsession, but something far more stable, self-respect. Because you're no longer waiting, no longer decoding, no longer chasing meaning in half-formed signals. You see the pattern, and you refuse to participate. And that's the paradox most people don't understand. The moment you stop accepting breadcrumbs, you stop being someone who can be breadcrumbed. Not because others change, but because you do. Your standards sharpen. Your tolerance for ambiguity shrinks, and your definition of connection transforms from something you hope for to something you require. And once that shift happens, breadcrumbing loses its power completely, because it was never about love, it was about access. And now, access is something you no longer give away for free.